Okay.
Hello, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well on this January 9th. This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour. I am Yves Engler, coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. And there is a lot to discuss about recent developments in Canadian foreign policy this week. So I think I'll just get right to it. And so we have a bit of time for questions and comments and interventions at the end. Again, I hope everyone is doing well. I hope it's not too cold where everyone is based. So to start off with, yesterday I was watching the CBC, the National.
What?
Sorry, I forgot to mute downstairs. So on the CBC, the National, there was it began with a 3-year commemoration of the downing of the Ukrainian airliner, where large numbers of I think it's 172, 175 people were killed, and a large number of those who are either Canadian citizens or permanent residents or living in Canada. And it was remarkable. It was a couple-minute clip. Trudeau was part of a celebration or commemoration in Toronto, I believe. And they completely ignored the context of the fact that the Americans assassinated the Iranian general a few days before, and then there was Iranian counterstrikes in Iraq, and Americans assassinated General Soleimani, and then I think about 9 other people were killed, and all this is just gone. Same thing in the Globe Mail article today, and same thing in the Le Devoir article I read. So now all of a sudden it's just Iran blew up an airliner. There's no context. There's some of the broader, beyond this sort of U.S. aggression that led to this tension, that led to this terrible error from the Iranians' part. That's just all kind of wiped out. And also the fact that the Iranian government has, while they initially denied it first a little bit, they admitted it was their fault, and then have offered compensation and some apology, whatnot. So it's pretty remarkable to see the CBC National do this, and of course this is all part of this sort of campaign that's targeting the Iranian government. And again, there's lots to question or dislike about the Iranian government, but if you look at some of the broader context of Canada's relations in the region, if you look at some of the broader history, of course, things get a lot more complicated than just Canada, the US, and others are the good guys trying to bring democracy to Iran, and the bad Iranian regime. Today, Defense Minister Anand formally announced the first tranche purchase of the F-35 fighter jet. So they made it explicitly clear that they have completely gone against their promise, explicit promise that Trudeau made multiple times before being elected in 2015, repeated after his election. I think mid 2016, was still saying we will not be purchasing the F-35. They have now committed huge amounts of money for that. The plan is to buy 88 fighter jets. That's what they're announcing. They're admitting it's going to be $70 billion. That's close to the figure that the anti-fighter jet coalition has been suggesting, that the life cycle costs would get towards 77 billion. The government itself is now admitting it's going to get to 70 billion, but they're moving forward with it. There's quite a bit of attention. There was demonstrations across the country over the weekend, and on Friday there was actually sort of a surprising amount of media coverage. The protests I went to here in Montreal, for first bit of it at least, there was only 6 or 7 of us there. I think a few more came later. I had to leave early, but they actually got like a pretty good story in Global News, and there was pretty good kind of cross-country media attention relative to how the media usually covers these things. And there was a disruption in Burlington, Ontario, next to Hamilton, that they had a protest outside, and then Tamara Lawrence and another activist, I'm not sure who it was, actually disrupted I think it's Minister Gould, her speech on this issue, and got a story into the media there. Now, in the Ottawa Citizen piece, David Puglisi quotes Tamara's research saying that the 19 billion that's supposed to go up front for the fighter jets, which this still doesn't make sense to me, because the initial $7 billion for the initial 16, I'm not seeing how it's going to only be 19 billion, but they're saying it's going to be $100 million a plane after that. I'm not exactly clear on these figures, but what they're saying is around 19 billion up front. Nonetheless, Tamara's research shows that could lead to could finance 15 state-of-the-art healthcare complexes, or 760 indigenous wellness centers, or 240 new high schools, or 130 kilometers of light rail transit, or 87,842 green affordable housing units. So that's a lot of much better stuff than fighter jets that money could go to, but the government is going full on this, and it's getting some pushback on technical grounds of how good are these fighter jets, but very little on the sort of bigger picture of what this is all about. And to me, there's 3 things this is about. This is channeling public funds to a powerful arms company, Lockheed Martin. This is interoperability with the US military, and Canada wanting to be interoperable with the US military. And this is about having the capacity to engage in offensive bombing wars, blowing up stuff, potentially fighting the Chinese or Russians, but most likely bombing, Libya, Serbia, Iraq, as Canada's fighter jets have done in recent decades. And that question really doesn't really get dealt with, but this is about giving the Canadian military the capacity, Canadian government and military the capacity to engage in the U.S. empire. And on that note, there was a big year in review kind of article interview that Murray Brewster, the chief military propagandist for the CBC, that he did a few days ago, where he kind of recaps some of what the chief of the defense staff, Wayne Ear, what he said in recent months, and then interviews him. And so he basically portrays Ear as being really aggressive in his sort of rhetoric, which is correct. He has said that the Canadian military industry needs to go on war footing, that China and Russia see themselves at war with Canada and the West, that those two countries are going to threaten Canada's, quote, tenuous hold over the Arctic. And in this interview, he says to Murray Brewster, that this is the chief of the defense staff, that he's been telling the planners at Department of National Defense to prepare like it's 1939. So to look back at how Canada went from a pretty small military before World War II up, and massively increased in a quite short period of time. So this is, of course, very aggressive kind of rhetoric. This is preparing for World War II, and this is something that needs to be challenged, of course. And it's very scary that they're talking about war with two nuclear armed states, right? I mean, I think the geopolitics of this, of viewing Russia and China as at war with Canada, is serious, has greater implications than their sort of regular kind of warmongering that is the constant for the Canadian military. But Brewster in his article kind of ignores that historical context, which of course he's totally aware of. He acts like the chief of defense staff's aggressive rhetoric is just a response to what Russia's doing, or just a response to what China is doing, and not that the Canadian military has a predilection for war. And I've written about this, and I just published a piece about it, but I talk about it in the People's History of the Canadian Military book. Just over and over again, the leaders of the Canadian military have, talked about how they want to go to war. So in 2012, then Chief of the Defense Staff Walter Nattingsink told the Canadian press, quote, "We have some men and women who have had 2, 3, and 4 tours. And what they're telling me is, sir, we've got that bumper sticker. Can we go somewhere else now?" Then he went on to say, you also have the young sailors, soldiers, airmen, and women who have just finished basic training, and they want to go somewhere. And in their minds, it was going to be Afghanistan. So if it's not Afghanistan, what's it going to be? They all want to serve. So they're just saying we need some conflict, some battle, some war, because you got these young recruits that they want to go to war. So this is sort of the thinking and the ideology that floats around in the Canadian military, and we need to be absolutely clear about that thinking. Which is troubling, of course, and push back against that. But that kind of thinking is even more troubling in the context of challenging going into war with nuclear armed states like China or Russia. And of course, Canada is in a sort of a low-level war right now with Russia in Ukraine. There's a good article in the Ottawa Citizen by Puglisi titled "Canadian Special Forces Involved in U.S. Military Team Accused of Killing Scores of Innocent People in Iraq and Syria." And so he shows that at least one, but the documents he received were all blacked out, the access to information documents, at least one Canadian Special Force that was with this U.S. team that was involved in all kinds of killings. Which is an issue that needs a lot more attention to what Canada's military has done in Iraq and Syria in recent years. There's a good article in the investigative journalism by the Investigative Journalism Foundation titled "Justin Trudeau selling record number of weapons to authoritarian countries." And it basically shows that there's a huge increase in arms sales to authoritarian countries under Trudeau versus Harper. An average of 1.3 billion annually versus 161 million during Harper. Now, most of that's probably almost certainly the big light armored vehicle contract with the Saudi monarchy, but there's a number of other sales involved in that. Alex Kosh in Briar Patch has this pretty interesting interview people might want to take a look at, titled "Doing Anti-Imperialism Journalism While the World Marches to War." Alex Kosh is editor at the not the Maple, the Maple, and he talks about the pushback he's had in covering, giving some context to Canada's role in the proxy war with, dating back years now, 7 years, the proxy war with Russia and Ukraine, and some of the context of how Canada helped provoke Russia's invasion and just the sort of backlash that came against him for that. Dimitri Lascaris also has an interesting article on whataboutism and the context, the historical context of that term, and how pro-imperialist forces have turned that idea on anti-imperialists, and basically arguing that whataboutism is a good thing. We need to be, giving context to all of a sudden we're, so concerned about what Russia's doing in Ukraine, but little concerned about what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen, or what Israel's doing to the Palestinians, or what the US is doing in Somalia, today, and infinite historical examples. So that's definitely worth taking a look at. Justin Trudeau is either in or en route to Mexico. There's going to be a summit with with Biden and AMLO, the president of Mexico. Today's Globe and Mail has a front page article that's kind of interesting, sort of this kind of attack against AMLO, basically, who's a leftist, not particularly radical leftist president, but clearly a left-wing president, and also clearly pursuing Latin American integrationist policies that displease Washington and Ottawa. So this Globe Mail articles is real sort of like moralizing, backsliding on democracy and undermining the freedom of the press kind of angle on critical of AMLO, which quite honestly I think is a good sign, because if that kind of type of article is not being published, that means that AMLO is not pushing with a sort of redistributionist anti-American kind of outlook. If a leftist president somewhere in Latin America is not receiving that type of criticism, it invariably means that they've buckled under the pressure and are not following through on what they were elected to do. But it says a lot about the Canadian media and how the political culture in this country operates, that we're going to go there, and it's kind of framed around Trudeau going there and upholding democracy and human rights, that we are the beacons of that, and we need to be pressuring the Mexicans to follow that. In the article, actually in the paper, in the business section of the paper, there's a interesting article about the sort of from a capitalist perspective of Canada's relationship to Mexico. And the basic point of the article is that Canadian investment in Mexico has really grown. And they're saying now in the last couple of years, Canada's the second major investor in Mexico after the US, surpassing Spain. But since I think it's 1990, they're saying that Canada has invested $50 billion in Mexico. Spain is 80 billion and the US is 310 billion, putting Canada at third. So 50 billion versus 310 billion for the US actually puts Canada substantially ahead on a per capita basis than the US, which I thought was kind of interesting, because US is about 10 times the size. And so that would of course be 500 billion. And in one of the press releases from Global Affairs Canada, they point out that 2/3, the Globe Mail article says that the major in Canadian investment, which we knew, was in mining, but also pipelines, natural gas pipelines. Canadian companies are dominant players in Mexico in that sector. And there's been some conflicts between the Canadian government and the Canadian companies and the Mexican government, a big lawsuit at an international tribunal by a Canadian company. And the article also points out that there's like 3 articles in the Globe about this Mexico summit, 2 in the business section. One of them points out that one of the things that Trudeau's going there to do and Biden are going to be putting pressure on AMLO, because AMLO has pursued nationalistic energy policies. His predecessor had been engaged in privatizing the big Pemex, the big national oil company, and they're basically saying that the policies that AMLO is pursuing go against the the new free trade accord that was signed. The predecessor to the successor, should I say, to NAFTA, and so Canada's going to be putting U.S. and Canada going to be putting pressure on AMLO to follow the rules of letting foreign companies have a bigger play in the energy sector in Mexico. But the other thing that is mentioned in the Globe article, but also in this press release from Global Affairs, is that 2/3 of all the mining in Mexico are Canadian companies. 2/3 of mining capital in Mexico are Canadian companies. And basically, with the process of NAFTA and the privatization of the sort of the communal land, the ejido system in Mexico, in the early 90s, that came with the beginning process of neoliberalism and adopting NAFTA that Mexico pursued, Canadian companies just skyrocketed in Mexico. Went from basically no Canadian mining companies to, at one point, there was a stat, it was like 375, I think, by 2010. And clearly, they're still dominant players in Mexico, and have very much benefited from these neoliberal policies. And there's been some conflicts between Canadian mining companies and AMLO, and the Canadian government has gotten involved in some of those conflicts. But I think, just looking at Canada's role in Mexico, I tried to find numbers about Mexican investment in Canada. I didn't search hard, but my guess is that there wouldn't be even a quarter of Mexican investment in Canada since 1990, right? So it's very much a one-way street, and it's Canadian companies going to Mexico and taking out resources, taking up, I mean, in the case of mining companies, literally the natural resources, but in the case of the pipeline companies or banks, extracting profit, and that really speaks to where Canada's position is in the global economy, global capitalism. When you see how much investment Canada has in Mexico, I'm sure people have seen that in Brazil there was a attempt to sort of coup attempt yesterday to sort of I guess oust Lula. It's not exactly clear what the real plan was, but definitely an effort to sort of sabotage the beginning of his administration. And fortunately, it's clearly been, at least in the short term, it's been a failure. Most leaders around the world condemned that effort, including Biden, including Justin Trudeau. So that's a good thing. I don't think that that's a completely genuine position. I think that the Canadian government was fine with Bolsonaro and would be okay with some type of return. The public relations of supporting that at this moment don't make that possible or feasible. But that might shift, and I think we've seen that historically. Not huge Canadian intervention, but when Dilma Rousseff, Lula's successor, was taken out in a sort of impeachment process that's described as a soft coup, the Canadian government was fine with that, didn't criticize it. They didn't criticize Lula being excluded from the elections, which is what allowed Bolsonaro to become president, and excluded based upon dubious charges that had him imprisoned and not able to run in the election. And also, if you go back historically, in 1964, when the U.S.-led coup against Jal Goulart, the Canadian government also was passively supportive of that coup. And there were officials from Brascan, the huge Canadian company in Brazil, which was called the Canadian octopus at one point, because its tentacles reached into so many different areas of the Brazilian economy. It was actually the biggest multinational corporation operating in South America for, I think, for decades, actually. A number of their officials who had very close ties with the Lester Pearson government of the day, ministers, later and previous ministers in the Pearson government, some of them were sort of implicated. Well, one of them, not actually the Brazilian, who was official of the company, Brascan, was deeply implicated in supporting the coup and was very tied into sort of fascist networks in Brazil. So Canada has a history of being fine with right-wing coups in Brazil. Right now, this is not the moment from a public relations standpoint to be able to pull that off. Lula has too much international sort of recognition, and I think this was not doesn't seem like it was a particularly well thought through plan to oust Lula. But I wouldn't at all surprise me if in 18 months from now, 2 years from now, we find another effort where the Canadian government is much more sympathetic to and maybe even engaged in. A few days ago, I think we're now into the fourth day, there was a general strike launched in Peru against the coup government, the Boluarte. And so there have been big protests, blockades, many parts of the country. And the Canadian government has clearly, as we've discussed in previous sessions of the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, has clearly enabled and sought to consolidate the removal of Pedro Castillo, who is a leftist that was largely ineffective. It's not clear completely to me, but in large part because the Congress sabotaged him, at every step of the way. But the Canadian government has clearly consolidated this coup effort in Peru, which has been murderous. I mean, a couple dozen people have been killed protesting the ouster. The military is sent out, martial law, etc. And I hadn't noticed this, but I just noticed a couple of days ago. On December 23rd, the Canadian ambassador in Lima actually went and met. There have been multiple things that Canada's done, statements that Canada's done to basically express support for Castillo's ouster. But on December 23rd, took it one step further and actually met with Boluarte, the Canadian ambassador, and put out a tweet saying, "I met today with President Boluarte, President of Peru, to reiterate Canada's commitment to continuing strengthening the relation and to support human rights and transparent and fair elections." So to continue strengthening relations, pretty clearly, committing Canada to back this sort of transition. They clearly want to make the transition as long as possible. Government. Now, what I haven't found, there was a Canadian Foreign Policy Institute letter a few weeks ago sent to the foreign minister and all the foreign affairs critics. I think about 600 or 700 people emailed everyone on this and calling on them to criticize, to align with the 15 countries in the hemisphere that have criticized Castillo's ouster. What I haven't seen is they hadn't seen any statements from any NDP officials on this. I may have missed them. The first one I saw, Don Davies, NDP MP in Vancouver, retweeted the tweet I put out a couple of days ago about the recent visit by the Canadian ambassador to meet with Boluarte. But I haven't seen anything from Heather McPherson on this. I actually, I checked her account. I haven't checked all the sort of left-wing NDP MPs on this, but I have not thus far seen any criticism from any MP about Canada's role in this coup effort in Peru. And this would, of course, be a very opportune moment to express the criticism, considering there is a general strike launched to try to reverse it. this would be a good moment, and I think people should, if they're on Twitter or other social media, put some pressure on some of these, at minimum, some of the left-wing NDP MPs to raise the issue. Saturday's National Post, the whole page, entire page was devoted to celebrating the 75th anniversary of Israel, which is kind of weird because it's not actually the 75th anniversary of Israel. And that doesn't come up for about 5 months. So the front page, big picture of somebody putting up an Israeli flag, climbing a flagpole to put up an Israeli flag. The bottom has like about 4 or 5 articles about Canada, Israel, all, I didn't read them all completely word to word, but I looked at them and I know the authors are all sort of basically Zionist fanatics. And apparently what this is part of a 5-month, they're preparing a 5-month, the National Post tweeted out today, a 5-month celebration of the apartheid state. So they started early. I guess they started right at the first Saturday issue that they published after the new year. And they're gonna, I don't know exactly how this is gonna play out over the next multiple months, but they are going to have this theme, which I think tells you this is the flagship newspaper of the biggest media chain, I believe, in the whole country, certainly biggest newspaper chain by a large margin in the country. And that's just a sort of little comment on the this political culture in this country on this issue. And another, to delve into this a little bit more in depth, there was a statement put out by Heather McPherson 2 or 3 days ago titled NDP Statement on Extremism Within Israel's New Government. Okay, so it's a statement, and this was, definitely viewed, this is supposed to be a pro-Palestinian statement. This is viewed as an intervention to call on the Canadian government to push back on the fanatics in Netanyahu's new government. Now, what are we really talking about here? What are we talking about is there are Jewish supremacist hardliners that are now ministers in the nuclear armed colonial outpost in the Middle East. That's what we're talking. And I raised the issue of Jewish supremacy because it doesn't, of course, use that word. That doesn't appear in the press release, even though that is what the press release is supposed to be, ostensibly supposed to be about, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about Jewish Power, a political party called Jewish Power, having ministerial positions in what is already a state based upon Jewish supremacy. And the NDP press release doesn't say anything about Jewish supremacy, but it does say something about rising anti-Semitism. So in a statement of basically supposed to be pushing back against rising Jewish supremacy, they can't use that word. They don't even use the word Jewish Power. They don't even name the political party Jewish Power, but they do criticize rising anti-Semitism, McPherson does, and links the rise of these Jewish supremacist parties in the new Netanyahu government, links that to the rise of the right, in North America or Europe. And that's that's certainly something worth considering, thinking about. Maybe some degrees of truth to it. But far more consequential is the fact that these, Jewish Power getting ministerial positions, the Kahnists, Meir Kahn, the followers of Meir Kahn, getting positions important positions, ministerial positions in the Netanyahu government, has much more to do with the logic of Zionism, which is of a supremacist, racist ideology based upon giving special rights to Jews over the indigenous Palestinian population. So it has a lot more to do with that than it has to do with the Maxime Bernier's party in Canada or Marine Le Pen in France, or whatever the far right kind of body you want to reference in North America or Europe. And it also has a lot more to do with the fact that we have given the apartheid state a complete blank check of backing whatever they do, whatever racism they pursue. We back it to the point where, we talked about it in the previous session, that Regavim, the settler colonial NGO that engaged in demolishing Palestine, helping demolish Palestinian homes. This is a charity. This is a group that they can fundraise in Canada and have Canadians can get tax write-offs through a sponsoring charity in this country. So and the founder of that NGO is now a minister of one of the far right ministers in Netanyahu's government. So we're talking about like direct link of how Canada's through this unique relationship of subsidizing charities focused on a country that has a GDP per capita equivalent to Canada's, and funneling hundreds of millions of dollars, more than $250 million a year in charitable funding to Israel, subsidized by the Canadian taxpayer. This is part of understanding the rise of a party like Jewish Power, and it's basically impunity, right? They know they have the backing of the U.S. empire, of Canada, of Britain, and they keep pushing the logic, the settler colonial Jewish supremacist logic of Israel. And we're in a situation where the NDP can put out a press release effectively criticizing this, but can't actually name it, but can name rising anti-Semitism. And it got me thinking about, if you what's a bigger problem in our world today? Is a bigger problem rising anti-Semitism or rising Jewish supremacy? And my first reaction is, because you only hear one side of that equation, obviously it has to be rising anti-Semitism. But if you think about it for a couple seconds, of course it's not. Of course, a much bigger problem in our world today is rising Jewish supremacy. And I know people don't want to talk about this because they're nervous that this will feed anti-Semitism in Canada or the US or wherever. But this is, I think, a discussion absolutely needs to happen. And when you see the NDP unable to even name it, but totally comfortable in naming rising anti-Semitism, it makes it even more so an important discussion to be had. On that note, I think I'll leave it there. And if people want to, have any comments or questions, go ahead. I think I see Laura right off the bat. Go ahead, Laura.
Sorry, yeah, I always seem to be off the bat. Well, I was just wondering, I'm noticing lately, like the incredible ramping up in Western media in the US and British media. I don't follow Canada too much, of the anti-Iran, and even by places that you wouldn't expect it, and very unfair coverage. And it seems to be just ramping up exponentially. And I, for the first time, had a Twitter message I was posting, refused. They said, your content is not valid. All I was pointing out was Western media coverage of the executions has been inappropriate, even though I condemn all capital punishment. And I think the judicial system in Iran is very dubious. But nonetheless, they're mentioning all the time that these are protesters for women's rights, without mentioning that in that dubious judicial system, they were convicted of killing or attempting to kill people, people in the security apparatus. And that's the first time I've had it, refused by Twitter, and I post all sorts of things. But I'm just seeing a ramping up of this anti-Iran fervor, and I'm just wondering if you're seeing that in Canadian media.
For sure. I tweeted, I don't know, a week, 10 days ago, criticizing a Canadian Dimension article, the big, long interview on Iran, and it just ignores the sanctions, ignores this like campaign, the killing of Iranian scientists by American and Israeli, backed forces, the constant attacks by the Israeli military in Syria against what they call Iranian targets. The head of the sanctions, the UN, forgetting her name, I think she's Belarusian UN rapporteur on sanctions. She put out
Alina Dohan.
Yeah, Alina Dohan. She put out a report, I think it's like in September, where she looked at the sanctions in Iran. And I don't remember the numbers right off the bat here, but it's a really shocking claims in this report about the effect of the sanctions in Iran, and just huge toll on the poorer Iranians, and the point of the American sanctions is to elicit popular opposition to the government, to help in destabilizing and potentially overthrowing the government. That's the point. It's not a hidden point. That is, like, we understand that's the point of this whole effort. And I think it's succeeding. Now, like, the problem is that the Iranian government is clearly repressive and is clearly patriarchal, and there's lots that are completely against my social outlook or values. But I don't I think that there is clearly a campaign that's being targeted against the Iranian government, and it's shocking how much of the left media, I did another story where I mentioned, it was it's a bit longer ago, where the Jacobin, a whole bunch of American left outlets, Canadian left outlets, who have all just sort of jumped into this kind of one-sided, and our media here, you have the three, it's fine. What happened with the people being blown up by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in shooting down the plane is horrible, obviously horrible. I believe it was an error. I believe the Iranian government's claim. That makes sense to me as what happened. It's, I guess, possible that's not what it was, but I think it almost certainly was an error. They were on high alert because of what had happened previously. And what had happened previously is the Americans did a gross violation of international law. And then Iran responded with a pretty minimal attack against some American facilities in Iraq. And apparently they may even have warned the Americans they were coming. So the American soldiers, they destroyed some facilities, but they didn't actually kill Americans. Whatever. So this is part, but that you can't talk about this without the context of what the act of aggression the Americans had pursued just before that. But the CBC and all the Canadian media is able to do that. So yeah, I think that unfortunately left media is heavily influenced by what is in the dominant media, and there's some issues now, like something like Palestine, where if you look at what's in Canadian Dimension or Rabble on Palestine, and you go and look at the National Post, it's night and day, right? There really is big differences, but that's based upon the activism of groups for many years, and sort of like campaigning on the issue, and sort of developing a sort of left-wing narrative, if you like, on that issue. And same thing, I think that you could say that with Haiti and some other issues, but I think that that often is, it takes work. It takes that campaigning, and so if that campaigning hasn't happened, oftentimes the left media will just sort of go along with the dominant media. The other part to it, I think, is explained by the diaspora question. In that there are clearly, most of the Iranian community in Canada, particularly, has gotten into a very, let's try to oust this government in Iran, and take the hardline elements are in complete control of the narrative now within the Iranian Canadian community, and that's a little bit new. That's sort of post the blowing up of the airplane. That's last 3 years, because the Iranian Canadian Congress, for instance, was campaigning until just before that, quite substantively, on restarting diplomatic relations with Iran. Now, I've had a couple conversations. I find this a kind of interesting point. I've had multiple conversations with people in the Iranian community, some of whom who are frame themselves as being left wing on this question. The one point that I don't I think needs unpacking, and I don't have the full, I haven't, done it myself fully, but a number of people they've pointed out, they said to me that, why they essentially say, well, why can't Iran just replicate Canada? Well, why can't they just couldn't it just be the sort of same kind of liberal dynamics as in Canadian political culture in Iran? And to me, that is just so removed from reality. I kind of get that someone who's an Iranian background, probably from a sort of more educated elite sector of Iran, comes to go to university in Canada. They appreciate a lot of the sort of like freedoms, go out drinking, or certain freedoms that they have in Canada. They might be much more curtailed in Iran. Not as much curtailed as sometimes is portrayed, but I think substantially more curtailed than they would be here. I get why that would be sort of appealing. But the geopolitical context, the regional context, the wealth context of Iran and Canada are just so divergent that if that's where their headspace is at, like I don't even really sort of exactly know what you say to them. You just the Americans have like bombed every single country on your border, like recently, right? And there's been like elicited so much from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. There's so much. Not to mention Iran itself. It's just the context is so different than thinking that you could sort of like have this sort of like liberal capitalist sort of G7 democracy that kind of Canada, whatever. It just, and so I think a lot of people in the Iranian Canadian community, they sort of see that they, obviously they're also inundated by the dominant media here as well, just like everyone in Canada is. And so I'm kind of startled by how far down that path people have gone, because at the end of the day, one of the the major the victims of Canada not having diplomatic relations with Iran is not me, is not most people on this on this call. It's mostly Iranian Canadians who have to go through all kinds of weird hoops. There's all these stories about they like can't travel to the U.S. I was reading a story about that a few weeks ago about some well-to-do person in like West Vancouver who like 30 years ago he had to go through like the Iranian military, I believe, or Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and now his kid, who's like I forget if it was like chess or some, and it was like some 16-year-old who's real flourishing in that and wants to go to some chess tournament in like, I don't know, in Denver, Colorado or something. I can't go because his time, it's just like a total nightmare situation. So there, there's lots of Iranian Canadians that are actually like hurt by this, but there is clearly the dominant ethos is pushing this sort of this like get tough on Iran and kind of dynamic. Go ahead, Yuri.
Hey, Eve, and Happy New Year to you and everyone. I hope you had a good holiday. Wow, there's so much to chew on from what you and Laura were saying about Iran. But it kind of baffles me, because I remember when I was researching more into Syria and the propaganda on Syria, and being quite baffled as to why so many left-leaning outlets and groups were supporting the non-existent moderate rebels in Syria, and the vicious, saga that Rania Khalek went through when she, just simply spoke the truth on Syria, that this was Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya all over again. And it's kind of bizarre, because looking back at the time, it was more easy to get people to be protesting against any possibility of a war on Iran or an invasion on Iran. Even when Soleimani was murdered, there were massive protests against Iran. You simply could not do that with Syria. Syria was like the unworthy victims for the left, and Iran was the worthy victims. But now it's gone a complete 180, where even some of like the best, left-wing groups, Marxist groups, are all like, yeah, we don't want an invasion of Iran. We certainly don't want a war for oil in Iran. But you know what? We got to overthrow like people are just doing like just this very bizarre like 180 where they more or less de facto support sanctions on Iran, even though there's also a lot of lies about how the woman was not brutally murdered by the morale police, but she did, die of heart failure in custody. And I don't know why that is. I'm curious your response, but could it just be that, for whatever reason, the Iranian diaspora, which is I don't know if they're which are left leaning, certainly secular. I think we can all agree that majority of the Iranian diaspora are secular. Could it just be that even though they know the history of imperialism in the Middle East, that they just think, well, you know what? It's time to do a Faustian pact and pray that the imperialists get their way with Iran, because at least we have secularism back in the country. Do you think that's what's happening? Because the last, and just the last thing I'll say is that just because I'm just sort of baffled as to how people just never seem to learn that it doesn't matter what even whatever legitimate grievances you have, for a fact that when Canada, Britain, the US and their allies have their way, it's going to be nothing but reactionary bullshit. And even if it is a secular thing, they're just going to be, I don't know, Iran's going to be just like another Egypt. It'll probably be a military dictatorship where the MEK is going to rule the show. So curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know enough about the ins and outs of the Iranian community and the degree to which they're secular and whatnot. I know. I've talked to Sadeh Kadir on this stuff, and she's very critical. She's sort of astounded where things have. She's on I think she's still on or was on the Iranian Canadian Congress executive, and she's kind of taken aback at how far, like, where things are all going, and how that's played out, and the turn within the Iranian Canadian community. And she puts a lot of it on the shooting down of the plane, and a lot of this sort of push, quite frankly, by pro-Israel groups, right? Like Kotler's group is right at the middle of pushing the family of the victims of the flight being shot down. But yeah, I don't exactly know how things have shifted so hard, but they really are. I mean, the Trudeau government was saying they wanted to restart diplomatic relations with Iran. That was how they got elected, and there was a push to do that early on that was backed by companies like Bombardier here, important capitalist companies that want to sell to Iran. That got blocked by a pushback from the Israel lobby. But it was still a dominant or a widely held position among the establishment, the NDP and others, pushing for that right until 2018, 2019. And then things have just gone completely in the opposite direction. So how all those dynamics have played out, I haven't followed it close enough to say with that much confidence, but it has shifted. Go ahead, John.
I'll just note parenthetically that when I was on the editorial collective for Canadian Dimension in the 80s, the stories about Israel, Zionism, and Jewish progressives were a challenge even then. This is a long-standing issue. What I'd like you to comment on, though, is, if you would, is there seems to be a bifurcation. Many progressives are focused on social issues in Canada, and there's another group of progressives that are focused on foreign policy issues, and your work is a brilliant example of the latter. But it seems to me often that progressives that are interested in poverty or social or class issues in Canada will not challenge the foreign policy mainstream view for fear of getting red baited or otherwise, and so you can only do so much, and you only have so much energy. So they sort of abandon that fight and focus on. Abandon is wrong. They focus on the fight that they're fighting, which is the local, whether it's the union or the poverty or whatever it is, Have you come across good examples of being able to build bridges or build communication or build common causes between the foreign policy progressives and the domestic progressives in the various organizations? Is that something you feel comfortable commenting on?
Yeah, I mean, like, the no fighter jet coalition was trying to. I mean, that's what Tamara is doing, where she puts out better ways of using those resources, right, for much more socially, ecologically beneficial. There's
Yeah,
been
and
efforts.
Project Plowshares before, along some time ago, same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. There's also been efforts at good article by Eric Schrag, I was in his class at Concordia back. He's an activist here in Montreal, where he talks about the campaign in the late 70s, early 80s about sort of demilitarizing Montreal, Quebec, the arms industry, which is major players in this area, and having more socially useful jobs, so transitioning the workforce to more socially useful jobs, and going into how you can, of course, the arms industry is very capital intensive versus daycare or education. So you create more jobs with which each dollar of investment. So from a union or a working class position, the investments in daycare or education are more are preferable. I mean, there's a gendered element to that whole question, I think, as well. But yeah, I mean, I personally, on like the Haiti solidarity movement in 2004, 2005, 2006, we reached out to a lot of unions. We ended with a certain amount of support from unions. I don't think it was deep. It was more like at the level of the more sort of activist oriented elements of the union bureaucracy, or maybe some elected officials. But yeah, I think what you're talking about is definitely the case. And I think what we've seen over the past 9-10 months, or last year really, with Russia's invasion and the couple months before that, and then also with China, I think that we've seen a situation where the sort of activists kind of focused on domestic issues, kind of left has become even more reluctant to touch foreign policy issues, and to question militarism, to question NATO, and we see that within the NDP. So we're in an even more difficult climate to make some of those arguments than we were even a year ago. So how do we get out of that? I think that you can't like when you got the head of the Canadian military talking about Canada being at war with Russia and China, or those countries seeing themselves at war with Russia, with Canada, like these are getting into some serious geopolitical kind of. We can't just leave this geopolitics in the hands of the militarists and the corporate types. That I mean, this is dangerous stuff. It's terrible when we leave it in the hands of the militarists who bomb Libya in 2011, or go occupy Afghanistan. That's terrible too. But the a war or anything close to that with China and Russia. I mean, the potential, the whole nuclear potential, just the sort of geopolitics will hit, or even at a higher level. So it's really dangerous to just sort of leave geopolitics in the hands of the militarists and the editorial pages of the National Post and Globe Mail.
Yeah. I would just say that I don't think most of the progressives that are in those movements necessarily agree with the mainstream. It's just they don't have the energy or see it as taking away from their fight for their domestic issue. So they agree with you, but they just don't make those links publicly. And I think that's a tragedy.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why I think, like, if the more space we take up, doing that, it makes it easier for those people who already sort of agree with us to start expressing that publicly, which then makes it even, a bit easier for the NDP MP that we already know there's some of them that agree with us, for them to express it, and then that make whatever. It's a whole, a snowball kind of situation. But it's how do we, it's always the chicken and egg, and how do we, the breakthrough in the dominant media, and all these kind of questions that are intertwined with. Go ahead, Laurel.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I just wanted to make 2 points. Number one, I came across an interview on power and politics with a man called Tom Lawson, who used to be the chief defense staff before Wayne Eyre, of course, and he agreed with you. He said that he thought Wayne Eyre was overstating things, and that it was not as bad as he was making out with respect to Russia and China. He had some misguided notions about the Russia. He seemed to think that Russia was falling apart, and I don't think that's the case. But he was critical of Eyre for overstating the threat from Russia and China, and for the need for Canada to get more militaristic. Although he did agree that there was an issue regarding recruitment. He says there are not enough kids, not enough young people who want to join the army, and he said that was partly COVID. That's what caused that. Anyway, and then the second thing I was going to say is I was curious to know why Trudeau changed his mind about the F-35 fighter jets from 2015. And I came across an article which quoted Anita Anand saying that his reasoning before, I guess, had to do with the flaws with the planes, that there were so many errors that needed to be fixed that he didn't want to buy them. And now she says they have matured. And so that's why they're safe to buy.
Yeah, I didn't see the interview on Power and Politics, but I read a CBC. I must have been a sort of summary of that interview where Lawson was criticizing the current chief of the defense staff or disagreeing with. That CBC article then had another official who was attacking Lawson for disagreeing with Wayne Eyre. So yeah, I mean, I think even people who you don't have to be particularly radical to think that this is bananas, that the head of the Canadian military is talking about how China and Russia see themselves at war with Canada, and they're about to take the Arctic, and then to say that we need to think about World War II as the model to what we need to do, and put the arms industry on war footing. I mean, this is stuff that's how does that get perceived in Moscow and Beijing? Like, how are the Chinese officials seeing that kind of rhetoric coming out of the head of the Canadian military? They obviously are like, whoa, these people want to actually go to war with us. This is so. So that's now also with regards to F-35, I think that there was a big campaign. It got a lot of traction, 2011, 2012, and it continued on against F-35. And so Trudeau's criticism of it was, I mean, I don't think anything Trudeau does is based upon his analysis of of almost anything, right? It's based upon like political calculations, so he wrote a critical. It was viewed as the F-35 was viewed as a Harper initiative, and it was sort of good politics to smack Harper with the F-35 question. And so now I don't know enough about the technical. I'm very makes me a little uncomfortable how I think some of the F-35 anti-F-35 campaign back a decade ago, how much it got into this sort of technical questions, and we're just wasting money versus they're not actually that good. And personally, if they're not that good, that's better than if they're really good in my mind, because they're less likely to kill people, right? So you always got to, and I get it from a tactical campaign, you do, to raise some of the technical questions as an opening into the dominant media. I think that is strategically smart and the right thing to do. But also, so how do you always navigate that question of the sort of more moral principled critique and the sort of tactical critique, which has more acceptability in the dominant discourse. But so I think there have been improvements. I mean, on the F-35. So that I don't think it's the Liberals aren't completely making it up that the capacities of the fighter jet are more reliable today than they were a decade ago, and where that's going. I don't know if that's completely. I mean, we've seen just recent stories about them being grounded, and there seems to be still serious problems. I don't know. I know nothing about the technology, so I don't. To comment seems kind of ridiculous, but yeah. Go ahead, Hans.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I don't know whether you've already dealt with the breaking development of the French, Germans, and now the British talking about following the Abrams tanks that Biden is sending. Does this not mark a major escalation in your view as well? Just reflecting back on the F-35, the collapse of the Europeans with their own development of the Eurofighter and now buying the F-35 surely reflects the total insistence of fealty by the Pentagon and the State Department that if you're with us, you're buying F-35s.
I agree with you. I think that is an important point. That the U.S. military-industrial complex benefits from NATO expansion, obviously benefits from interoperability, and particularly Europe, Canada as well. I think Canada is more assumed, and that is part of what the F-35 sort of success in terms of sales speaks to the power of the US. And another side to that, of course, is what's happening in the Ukraine, where the US has very much subordinated German and French policy to their policy, or to the NATO policy, which is really US policy, or US or Anglosphere, US, Britain, Canada policy. And so the US clearly and Canada clearly want to draw in Germany and France even more in terms of sending more weapons to the Ukrainian military. Now, in terms of the escalation of the arms delivery, how much of an escalation that is, I don't really know. I don't know that I understand weapon systems well enough to know the sort of distinctions, or you understand how war fighting well enough to know the distinctions of what different weapons sort of mean in terms of the balance of forces on the ground and stuff like that. But there's no doubt that there's a sort of constant escalation that's going on. That's and the how quiet it's all being done is part of the sort of worry about it all, right? Is that we're just sort of one little step after next step after next step after next step, where where you get to a situation where the Russians may think that dropping some form of nuclear weapon has some that they need to do that, right? So that's a serious danger, and Canada's pushing it at every level, right? There's a story about all the Canadian light armored vehicles that have reached the front a couple of days ago that was reported, and it's all sort of it's just it keeps going, and then just the horrors about what is happening to Ukrainians is just shocking, right? The amount of death and destruction, and even the, I mean, so Ukraine has a big success, and they kill whatever the 89 or hundreds of Russian recruits. I mean, that's that's acceptable by the laws of war, but that's horrible, right? Like this is all just such a disaster. Yeah, and the Canadian government has been right there at every step of the way, part of escalating all this, and with unfortunately very, very little reaction from peace, internationalist, anti-war kind of forces. If there's not any more comments or questions, we're past 7 o'clock. Thanks everyone for your interventions, and same place, same time next week. Have a good evening. Take care.
Thank you.
There's Eve.
Cheers. Yeah.